Thank you guys for coming. This is our second talk for the OVC Animal Welfare Club's Welfare Forum. So today we have a special guest. We have Dr. Jennifer Mather. She is joining us virtually, so she's online. You can see her just in the top corner of the screen there. So Dr. Mather is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Lethbridge. She is an expert in cephalopod behavior and intelligence. And she also acted as the scientific advisor for the Oscar-winning documentary, My Octopus Teacher. If any of you have watched that, it is on Netflix. In her talk today, she will be discussing octopus intelligence, cognition, and behavior, and how it all relates to their welfare implications today. So I'll pass it on over to her now.
Thank you. You got me? I could probably tell you that this is actually a picture of me. Me on the right, the octopus on the left. It was a bit staged, but it does give you some idea of what one can do if one is lucky. Because it turns out we were in the island of Moorea, which is wonderful to think about at this time of year in Canada. And we were just watching, observing octopuses and trying to figure out what they were eating, what they were choosing to eat, and whether it had anything to do with the habitat that they were living in, whether it had anything to do with the personality that they had, which turned out to be yes in both cases. It also shows you, though it's relatively unusual to find it, that some individual octopuses will completely tolerate being followed by humans, which is kind of nice. So, next slide. Next slide. Okay. Now, I'll have to back up a little bit because this is the second of two talks that I give in an introductory course in the department. So I want to fill in a little bit of a background. Let's just say octopuses are very intelligent. They're sensitive. They probably perceive pain. And they're definitely very aware of their surroundings and can predict what's going on in the future. All of this means that they are animals that we ought to care about. But for quite a while, we really haven't looked at anything about intelligence, anything about sentience in invertebrates. What our theory has been in terms of the development of high intelligence is that it's correlated more with social situations and the necessity to understand what other individuals are perhaps thinking, rather than in non-social or ecological situations. And since octopuses are solitary, the fact that they might be very intelligent, that they might be sentient, that they might be sensitive, has kind of been dismissed. And the reason for that is really human. It's not because of what the animals are really like. It's because we are very anthropocentric. This is a theme really that has gone through the development of Western civilization. So this is Aristotle. Aristotle believed that you could talk about a hierarchy of intelligence and sensitivity. Notice going past the shellfish and the reptiles and the eels, past the birds, the monkeys, man, and that of course, angels had a soul and they were the most important and best. So gradually this developed into the theory of social intelligence, and then people simply didn't think about intelligence in animals that were not very social, particularly the quote unquote lower vertebrates and any invertebrates at all. So next slide. When it comes to thinking about animal welfare, the science is only part of what's going on. So if we say, well, we have decided that the social theory of intelligence is the most important one, so the very social animals like the primates clearly need to be cared for most. Just because science knows something doesn't mean that somehow or other it immediately translates into welfare. The second thing that has to happen is that people have to think about the ethics of what you might be doing to the animals and the care that you might give the animals and what kind of care they would need, because you cannot say whatever kind of care I would give a veal calf can be paralleled neatly by any kind of care that I would give an octopus. So that's a knowledge base, and it really is a scientific knowledge base, but people don't really think about it. And unfortunately, or fortunately in some cases, the other part of the triangle is popular opinion and politics. So the politics, for instance, in the United States of the, I want to call them companies almost, that rear domestic animals, the agricultural units, so to speak, they're often exerting pressure on the people who are trying to figure out the ethics, who are trying to look at the science and trying to figure out what kind of welfare demands we need to make. So this was probably true in the European Union when they turned down decapod crustaceans for welfare, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the other thing is popular opinion. I did a paper on popular opinion about invertebrates. And it's clear that it's negative in most cases, particularly insects. Now, it's also clear this is built into society, because if you look at 5-year-olds, they don't have any particular prejudice against bugs or creepy qualities. But by the time you get to elementary school, you begin to see this negative viewpoint of invertebrates. So in order to think about animal welfare, we have to think about the 3 parts of this triangle. Next. Now, I can actually trace how the general public, to some extent, but definitely the scientific community, began to think that we should worry about the welfare of cephalopods, octopuses, squid, cuttlefish. And it was a meeting in Cambridge when a great number of people, most of whom were neuroscientists actually, and some of whom were animal behaviorists, got together and said, we're beginning to care about animal sentience. And we know we humans are sentient, but are there any other animals? And in this case, what was interesting that he said that had the neural substrate for consciousness and sentience. And they concluded that there were a fair number of mammals that had potential consciousness. There were some birds, in particular, these are the parrots and the corvids, and octopuses. And this was completely unprecedented, okay? And it began to sort of slowly spread like a ripple through the scientific community. Gee, maybe we should worry about them. That octopuses might have the combination of intelligence and consciousness that would lead to self-awareness, that would lead to subjective experiences such as pain, and that maybe we ought to worry about them. Okay, next. That, by the way, that was 2012. But it started for me a long time before that. And it started for me in a very interesting way. The kind of thing that happens in hallways. So Gail Michener, who was at that time in our biology department, was also on, I think it was the organizing committee of the Canadian Council of Animal Care. And what CCAC does is it sets the standards and the guidelines and the procedures for animals in research. And it's got quite a bit of clout. I remember at one point they went into University of Toronto, and one year they said, we're not very happy with your animal care facilities. You really should do better. And then they came back the next year and they said, hey, you haven't done it any better. And they said, oh, we can't find the money. Doesn't that sound familiar? And they said, oh, well, we'll just withdraw all insert funding from the university until you fix it. And it didn't take very long for them to fix it. So they have quite a bit of clout. But what Gail said to me is, according to the USDA guidelines, you could do anything that you wanted to invertebrates, anything that you could do to tissue. She said, do you think of your invertebrates as tissue? And I said, no, of course not. So because she had the clout, she convened a very small committee. And we actually had a one-day mini conference in Ottawa at the meeting of the Canadian Union of Biological Scientists just before Christmas. So I picked up this picture because the only recreational thing I remember doing at that particular conference was going and seeing the Christmas lights turn on in the Parliament buildings. That was kind of nice. But we thought about it and we came back and we talked to other people and we concluded that it indeed would be necessary that for insert funded research specifically and generally for research, we should be concerned with the welfare of cephalopods. There should be procedures that should be carried out to figure out that they were doing okay, essentially the same as what they had for vertebrates. That was about the mid-1990s. So Canada was the first to actually make any formal designation for standards of care for cephalopods. Next. Things moved very slowly. There's no doubt about it. So I went on with my work and I was doing field work, so I didn't really have to do much in terms of care standards. They've got a little bit tougher on field work now. But in those days, I remember there were 3 questions. One of them was, what do you feed your animals? Like, how are you going to feed your animals? No. How are you going to care for your animals? No. What are you going to do after the research was over? And I remember being thoroughly tempted to write, go away and stop bothering them. But again, I was having one of these informal discussions that you have in the evening at conferences. And it turned out that one of the people, and we were talking about pain, and one of the people there was the editor of JAWS, Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science. And he emailed me afterwards and said, you know, this is something we need to worry about. Would you mind writing a paper for JAWS? And I said, no, okay, that sounds fine. And let me remind you, even though you probably already completely know, that when we're talking about suffering, what we're talking about is unpleasant, painful, aversive experiences, either harm or a threat of it. So it takes a little bit of thought to decide what you might do that would cause suffering in an octopus. But it's a very good learning animal. So there's absolutely no doubt that they can learn that a situation is aversive, that a situation would harm them. And they can change their behavior in the future. And we assume that if they don't have any control, that they would indeed expect an unpleasant experience and be, so to speak, upset by not being able to avoid it. Next slide. See, it's also not true that the people who were looking at animal care and animals in use for research weren't thinking about just exactly what might be true for invertebrates in captive situations. So this is 2007, it's quite a bit later. The people who organized the, I'm sorry, I think it's the Diseases of Aquatic Organisms group, but this is definitely the journal. They said, maybe we should be thinking about, notice for the first time, we should be thinking about the ethics of care for invertebrates. And so I wrote an article for them looking in through the past and the present philosophical viewpoint. Ethics can be described as the moral principles that govern a person's behavior. And there's a whole field of research to discover what ethics is. And of course, each individual to some extent is different. Okay, so I'm going to be reminding, I don't have to remind you, I'm sure, but I would at this point be reminding the class about the World Animal Welfare 5 Freedoms. It's obviously not exactly set up for cephalopods because cephalopods don't have to worry about thirst, but freedom from hunger, discomfort, pain and injury, fear and distress. And the positives, the freedom to express normal behaviors. And I haven't done anything about this, but I was recently skimming the titles in Frontiers in Marine Biology, I believe it is, which has a whole lot of sort of leading articles. And they had a study that had been done in China. They wanted to look at octopus senescence, and senescence is the end of the life cycle. And in order to do that, they set up 3 groups. They had a group of senescent individuals, they had a group of individuals that were mature but not into senescence, and they had a group of individuals they simply starved because senescent animals don't eat. And I was appalled. Think freedom from hunger. But in China, there's absolutely no regulation about what you can do to cephalopods. And I still have to write the Frontiers people and say, all right, you can't change them, but you shouldn't publish things in which you simply starved an animal for 40 days. Think of it if it was kittens. Next slide. In about 2000, the European Union began to think about their welfare regulations. And one of the things that they did in the process is they said, well, you know, the last time we did it was 1960. And whatever it is has changed. One of the things that's changed is we know more about sentience in animals. Maybe we should protect animals other than vertebrates. And so they consulted fairly widely, including with me, because of the Canadian standards. And in the end, they decided to include cephalopods as animals that they should care about the welfare of. And as I said, they rejected decapod crustaceans. But I think that was politics, and I don't know for sure. Now, the European Union actually was a watershed in our understanding of the welfare of cephalopods, because it was not just in research, rather their welfare for anybody keeping them in captivity and their welfare during capture as a food resource. This is something we're just beginning to do with fish as well. You know, what are we doing to them when we catch them? And so they set up different committees that met in different places. I remember wondering why we were meeting at Berlin for a marine animal situation, but it was, Germany was one of the signatories of this treaty, of course, because Germany's part of Brexit. And in this particular situation, we met to talk about euthanasia, because we realized that while we have a few chemicals that anesthetize cephalopods, we didn't really know what was going on physiologically. They're difficult to record from. Octopuses are difficult to record from for 2 different reasons. One is that they can just reach in with their arm and pick out a probe if they don't like it. But another is that if you have a probe, for instance, in the brain, the octopus has voluntary control over the control of the circulation of the blood. So they can simply shut off the blood circulation to that area and the area will die. But we were particularly concerned because we realized that we knew that the anesthetic immobilized the animals, but we weren't sure that it actually got rid of brain function. So we might have had an immobile suffering animal. And Robin Crook, who's in San Francisco, actually managed to do some research shortly thereafter. And she found that, yes, indeed, it was magnesium chloride, I think is the best. And it was actually anesthetizing the brain as well as immobilizing the animal. Next. Now in Quebec, I'm not quite sure why Quebec, but in Quebec, they are very concerned with ethics and the law. And they set up a conference in order to look at the linkages from science of what we know for animal consciousness to the philosophy of the attitudes and values to law. Okay, they believe that there's this real obvious science philosopher to lawgiver that we needed to look at. And so they decided to bring a representative from each of the major animal groups that they might care about, so that we could talk about what we saw as suffering, consciousness, and legal issues, not really for legal issues in our particular animal group. And so they flew us to Paris. It's the only conference I've ever been at, by the way. It was really quite interesting. It was organized by University of Quebec, Montreal, and it was actually functionally bilingual, French and English, both because it was Quebec and because it was in Paris. And I'm not sure that they accomplished anything legal so much as getting the ability to generate a foundation for the legal principles. And for the class, I wanted to remind them about Jeremy Bentham's comment, not that they can reason, not that they can talk, because of course invertebrates can't talk and most non-human animals can't talk, but can they suffer? And that's something to keep in mind, definitely. Next. We're actually advancing fairly fast across time, and I'm going to have to slow down a bit. I was doing work with Claudio Carrere in Italy and was beginning to get into animal welfare. And one of the things that we began to talk about is welfare of invertebrates. Well, the Springer people got in touch with him and said, gee, maybe we need to do something on invertebrates. What about a book in the series? And in some ways, this is a real breakthrough. I'll mention that in a moment. But he emailed me and said, what do you think, should we do this? And I said, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't even thought about the series. I think there's one on dogs, there's one on cats, one on pigs. I'm sure you know it more than I do. But I emailed him back and said, oh, the other 99% of the animals on the planet, gee, it's a good thing that they should be, we should look at their welfare. So for us, I think in some ways that this was very important because we began to reach out and to think about not so much do they deserve welfare, but can we find people who can talk about what their welfare means? And we have a wide variety of chapters. So the cephalopods, obviously, and the decapod crustaceans, and we knew who was doing work in those. And one group that we specifically wanted to look at was the bees. The bees are beginning to get more attention now in terms of their welfare and also in terms of their consciousness, because there's some very interesting research going on in how they can play, how they can predict the future, and they look a lot smarter than we used to think they were. But another reason to protect bees, which pretty well everybody knows, is that they pollinate about 30 or 40% of our agricultural crop. So if we don't take care of the welfare of bees, we're just not going to have an awful lot of our normal diet. Presently, only Switzerland protects bees. And I was just talking to a colleague recently about animal welfare issues. She's doing research on bees here at the University of Lethbridge, and she doesn't have to do any welfare assessment whatsoever. And this, but it goes further than saying that somebody formally has to assess the welfare. That's an end point. I think caring about the animals, knowing what the animals do, knowing how to make their lives better is really important. And so I think this book very much widened the scope of looking at invertebrate welfare. Next slide. If you remember the triangle that I had of the science and the ethics and the politics and the public consciousness, there's absolutely no doubt that Greg Foster, as my octopus teacher, was a huge wake-up call for a whole lot of people. Because suddenly they went, oh, they're not just things. And the man and the octopus can have what looks suspiciously like friendship. And the fact that it won an Oscar, of course, is just great publicity and wonderful. But it really helped in the third part of this triangle, I think, that people, ordinary people, people who are making decisions, they began to say, oh, maybe we should care about those guys. Next slide. I'm going to have to slow down a bit here because there have been things happening since I was here. Anyway, the reason I put this one on is that judging the contest in Raleigh was not the very first time I'd ever interacted with veterinary people, because there was a short course for graduate students in Copenhagen in February 2020. And they like to have somebody who's completely outside the normal small mammal care. So they asked me if I would come there. I don't think it was particularly successful. It's going to be, I would estimate, quite a while before veterinary practice extends more widely. Though I have very, very strong suspicions that that's going to be fish that are the next group that the veterinary practices begin to extend their coverage to. And I put that down there because when I left for Europe, there was COVID in Italy, and by the time I left to come back a week later, COVID was all around Europe. And in fact, I caught it probably on the way back home to Calgary. Luckily, it was a light dose. Next. When Britain separated from the European Union, they began in many, many cases to have to tailor their laws according to what they wanted. There were a bunch of people in the UK who thought that crustaceans should be included in welfare. They worked for it in the European Union. And as soon as the UK left the European Union, these people became much more active. And they said, okay, we have to have separate regulations. Now is our chance to get the cephalopods protected. And they talked to many people, myself included. And eventually, not too long after, they asked for a study to be commissioned to see whether cephalopods would have sentience, and to see whether crustaceans would have sentience, and to see whether they should be cared for in welfare regulations. And because the UK government specifically asked Jonathan Birch, who's at the London School of Economics, to make recommendations, what they came out with was, yes, there is a good chance that cephalopods are sentient. Yes, there's a good chance decapod crustaceans are sentient. But because the government had commissioned this, they simply turned around and said, okay, what you recommend, we shall do. And the UK now has regulations for care, capture, whatever it might be, in terms of cephalopods and also in terms of decapod crustaceans. Now, nobody's protected decapod crustaceans before. We're talking lobsters, crabs, shrimp. And I suspect, as there was when we started thinking about protecting cephalopods, there will be some hitches. For instance, there are people who raise shrimp, and I believe they want them to come into reproductive maturity. And there's a gland on the eye stalk that controls the maturity. So if they simply cut off the eye stalks, they will come into maturity. But in the process, you make them blind. And well, as far as I know, nobody has done anything about that yet. I can see that coming because it would be very obvious that this is cruelty and causing suffering to blind an animal. So this is probably coming along the way. Now, I haven't got a slide for this because this is actually quite recent. But just because there are no regulations in the US doesn't mean that normal practice doesn't demand some care for cephalopods. So I have done research with several people in several different institutions. And for instance, my colleague at University of Southern California was told, yes, you do have to worry about welfare. Yes, you have to put a proposal for their IACUC committee. And similarly, I'm planning some work with a colleague at Rockefeller University. And before he could keep octopuses, he had to have passed all the animal welfare regulations. But there's no legal requirement. And there is a group called Physicians for Moral Responsibility, and also a couple of professors at Harvard. And they're very concerned about the fact that there are no regulations. So they got me talking to them as their advisor. A couple of years ago, they tried to get NIH, National Institute of Health, to do something about regulating welfare in cephalopods in research. And they were not successful. So earlier this fall, they thought, well, maybe if we have a congressional briefing, maybe we can get Congress to put some pressure on NIH. And so they asked me to be part of this congressional briefing, which is certainly something I never expected to be doing as a university professor. And we did it, and nothing so far has happened, but I think it's the thin edge of the wedge. Of course, one of the things that American researchers have to worry about is that just because they don't have any regulations in the country about what they can do to cephalopods, if they submit papers to scholarly journals, the scholarly journals may indeed have regulations. And so, for instance, if you submit to Animal Behavior and you haven't done anything about welfare, you can probably kiss the acceptance goodbye, because this is considered to be something that you need before you can publish in ABS, partly because it's both British-centered and American-centered. So I think it's coming in the United States, because eventually they're going to figure out that they're behind the times. Is it coming? It's a good question. Is it coming for animals other than cephalopods? Probably much more slowly. Definitely animal welfare regulation is either in place or is coming for fish. And I think in some ways that's the next big thing that veterinarians are going to have to worry about. Though you may already be worrying about it, so you can tell me about that. Okay, next slide. If I were to say, okay, where do we go from here thinking about invertebrate welfare? Probably the first thing would be more research. We just really don't know. The example of, do we know if the anesthetic is anesthetizing the brain as well as the body? That's a good example of the kind of research we need to do. And often we don't know the exact conditions under which animals are kept and whether they are indeed a problem for welfare regulation. So I remember hearing at one of the EU conferences that and I don't want to demonize one particular country, but I think it was one particular fishing practice in Italy, that the fishers would catch the octopus and drop it into a bucket of fresh water. Now, of course, they don't breathe fresh water, so they would die. So why would they put them through this kind of suffering? Well, it turns out that the osmotic pressure tries to equalize across membranes. So if you put an animal that has, of course, the normal salinity of blood and body of salt water, and you put it in fresh water, then it will take up some of the fresh water, trying to equalize the osmotic pressure across the membranes. In other words, what would happen is the animal would gain weight. The weight would be all water, but by the time you got it to the market, you had a heavier animal than you had when you caught it, and therefore you would get more money for it. A practice like that obviously has to stop. Yes, we need more regulations, the Americans, but we probably all need to think about what kind of regulations, what kind of invertebrate, because it's not just about sentience. Remember Bentham saying it's about suffering. And I would guess our biggest problem is going to be to understand and to protect insects. It's absolutely widespread that what we do is we kill them. It's absolutely widespread that what we do is we fear them and we're disgusted by them. But they're 60% of the animals on the planet. We're going to have to wake up. And I can only argue for more concern for the animals, less exploitation of the animals and the planet in general. Next slide. I think I'd be happy to answer questions.